Israel may find itself in a situation where it is more isolated than it has been since its foundation in 1948. Every time they've been criticised over the past 12 months, they have increasingly used the recourse to say that these institutions are institutionally biased against them, if not sometimes even anti-Semitic. And that has gone up to and included the UN itself.
This is a very, very bad day for the state of Israel.
The International Criminal Court is issuing arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant,
accusing them of war crimes in Gaza and also for a top Hamas commander.
The International Criminal Court has just issued an arrest warrant.
These are serious charges.
This is a real bombshell from the International Criminal Court.
This is obviously a stunning development.
This is a story that is going to ricochet around the world. The idea of an Israeli prime minister essentially being landlocked now because he can't go anywhere else for fear of arrest because of this arrest warrant is an extraordinary development.
The ICC, the International Criminal Court arrest warrant, landed this afternoon on Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Israeli Defense Minister. It means that they are wanted for alleged war crimes. Where does it leave Israel, the war in Gaza, and is there any legitimacy left to what they're doing? Welcome to the News Agents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And later on, we'll be looking back on the life and the influence that John Prescott has had on the Labour Party, what his contribution adds up to, and his lasting legacy.
But first, we're going to start with the news that the ICC has issued, the International Criminal Court, I should say, has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, the former Defense Secretary, Yoav Gallant, and also the current leader of Hamas.
It is a piece of news that has sort of ricocheted globally around the newsrooms in the last few minutes. Now, why this is important is because it is a rejection of Israel's appeal. Israel had appealed and declared that because it wasn't a member, it didn't have to recognise the ICC. And the ICC has come back and said basically that Israel's acceptance of its own jurisdiction doesn't matter. In other words, they've put out a long statement now and they've ruled on two requests submitted by Israel back in September. The first request, Israel challenged the court's jurisdiction and they basically said that doesn't matter. And they've also rejected Israel's request that the prosecution notify Israel of an initiation investigation. And again, they've decided that doesn't matter either. So we are at the stage now where Benjamin Netanyahu, the actual Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister of Israel, cannot land in any one of 124, I think, countries without a warrant for his arrest being issued.
I think it's just worth looking at what the ICC have said and why it is that they've decided to issue this arrest warrant on Netanyahu and Gallant. And as Emily said, Hamas leaders as well. But obviously, Israel is a democratically elected state or has a democratically elected government, so this news is going to feel especially consequential for Netanyahu. They have said that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, and Gallant, the then Defence Secretary, quotes, bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare. They also said that there are reasonable grounds to believe that they had, quote, intentionally and knowingly deprived Gaza's civilians of food, water, medicine, medical supplies, fuel and electricity, and using those means as a mechanism of war, which is against, as has long been argued by Israel's critics, international humanitarian law. This is something that has long been rejected and denied by Netanyahu and his government. Their lawyers saying that these warrants are absurd and false and a distortion of reality. But clearly, the allegation that Israel is behaving in a way which is completely disproportionate, improper, and lacking any humanitarian value is absolutely copper-bottomed and legitimised by this warrant.
And that is why there will be such shock in Israel. I suspect even among some people who absolutely loathe Netanyahu, because Israel depends greatly on its good relations with Western allies. And so the idea that the Israeli Prime Minister could not get on a plane and come to Britain now, where he was once a regular visitor, or to France, or to Germany, because he might be arrested, will be profoundly shocking. I've seen a statement from Netanyahu's predecessor, Naftali Bennett, who would very much like to succeed Netanyahu as the next Prime Minister of Israel, saying the ICC arrest warrants are a mark of shame, not of Israel's leaders, but of the ICC itself and its members. On October the 7th, Hamas brutally attacked Israel, murdering, burning alive and raping over 1,200 Israelis. Israel is fighting back, the most just of wars against pure evil. All Israelis, left and right, stand behind the war, whose goals are to release the kidnapped Israelis, demolish Hamas, and restore security to Israel. Shame on ICC. Now, I'm not saying that is going to be a representative opinion coming out of Israel, but I think that this is a profound shock that will be felt by all Israelis. The idea that the ICC has its Prime Minister in their crosshairs for the reasons that, Lewis, you have just set out.
I mean, in terms of the effect that this has on what Israel does now, look, it puts Israel's allies, especially countries like the UK, especially headed up by a Prime Minister who is a former international human rights lawyer, who has repeatedly said that he has the utmost respect for international law, international institutions, international norms. It puts us, the British government, but also other governments which are signatories to the ICC, members of the ICC, in the most awkward position. The British government has previously said that they did not believe that these allegations, did not support the idea that these things were going on, although they did recognise there had been infringements of international human rights law. But what does David Lammy say now? What does Keir Starmer say? Do they support these arrest warrants? Will they, as a result of this, continue to provide military support to Israel and to the government of Israel, and financial support and all of the other types of aid that the critics of Israel and the British government and other Western governments as well have long said should no longer be happening, because they were the ones saying that these allegations, that these war crimes were happening, long denied, or at least for which there had been long scepticism from Western governments?
Well, one thing I think you can assume is that first out of the traps to Netanyahu's defence will probably be one Donald Trump, who will take that same position that the ICC is basically a cocked up court that, you know, doesn't understand what it's talking about and has tried to vilify the one democracy in the Middle East. And it'll be very interesting, I guess, to hear from those incoming in the administration, people like Peter Hesketh, who has up till now been a Fox News presenter for the last 10 years, admittedly one with previous military experience, but but where are they going to stand? Presumably at Trump's side, which is presumably a Netanyahu side. I do think it's interesting. I'm just reading through the ICC report now, and they've really detailed very specifically how they've come to their decisions. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that they've talked about Israel ignoring warnings. They've said the chamber found reasonable grounds to believe that no clear military need or other justification under international humanitarian law could be identified for the restrictions placed on access to humanitarian relief. In other words, this question of whether they had essentially forced a kind of starvation. And it says, despite warnings and appeals made by the UN Security Council, the UN Security General, states and governmental and civil society organizations, only minimal humanitarian assistance was authorized. In other words, they're saying to Israel, you were warned, you were told, individual countries told you this, international bodies told you this, you have been put on warning and you ignored it all and you failed to really make your case for why you had to deny humanitarian assistance. I think it's very important to understand that the ICC, that the arrest warrant has not been issued in response to the actual defence or the military defence that Israel has waged. The war essentially it's waged on Gaza through its military actions, but through its denial of humanitarian assistance. And I guess that does speak to the question of our government and many other governments, which is, are they now feeling like they do have a voice in this because they weren't listened to the first time round, and the ICC is saying that's part of the problem?
The other problem for Israel in all of this is you look at the countries that Netanyahu could now go to. He could still go to Azerbaijan, Belarus, North Korea, a few other sundry countries as well, Saudi Arabia. Those are not signatories to the International Criminal Court.
The United States, of course.
The United States, of course, as well. And so they're not exactly the places where Israel would want to think, well, we've got friends here. Because Israel's legitimacy comes a lot from the fact that it is a very quarrelsome, lively, liberal democracy in many ways, where there are free and fair elections and, people have the right to say and speak, and you've got a proportional representation system, and people look at it and say this is the beacon in the Middle East where democracy exists. Totally. And I think that Israel's position is, really seriously compromised. And this is a very, very bad day for the state of Israel.
I don't think it's hyperbole to say that as a result of this judgment, even if states or other countries still have inherent sympathy with the nation, with Israelis, with October the 7th, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that Israel may find itself in a situation where it is more isolated than it has been since its foundation in 1948. Because how could it not? Yes, it is true to say it will, irrespective, continue to receive substantial support from the United States. It has done from the Biden administration, even though Biden himself was deeply displeased with the policies, particularly the humanitarian policies, which this judgment, on which, as Emily said, this judgment is largely founded. He was unhappy with that, but continued to provide support anyway. Trump will as well. But certainly in terms of her other allies in Europe and traditional Western allies, relations were already difficult, icy, with many of those countries, not least countries like France, Spain, increasingly Britain. But this puts those countries, the legitimacy of Israel as a state, John, as you say, which has long been anchored in the fact that it is a piece of democratic exceptionalism in an otherwise highly illiberal region. It can be no other but highly tarnished by this. Because what will Israel say? Israel has already said, and people within Israel have already said, including Netanyahu, but not just Netanyahu, every time they've been criticised over the past 12 months, they have increasingly used the recourse to say that these institutions are institutionally biased against them, if not sometimes even anti-Semitic. And that has gone up to and included the UN itself. Now, that's not to say the UN and these institutions are perfect, but that is going to be the response that we're going to see today about the ICC. But it comes to a point when you can't say, it can't be like Millwall. It's like everybody hates us, but we don't care. In the end, that has an effect, and it has an effect on your international standing.
Israel has to care.
Israel has to care in the end, because she relies on her allies ultimately.
I think domestically it's now going to be really interesting. And I guess there are two responses. Either people rally to the flag. They say, this is appalling. Israel was trying to defend herself. We haven't even mentioned yet the events of October the 7th, the Hamas atrocities, the sexual war crimes and the mutilation, all the rest of it, which clearly is part of the ICC's ruling on the members of Hamas as well. But either you will find Israeli citizens sort of rally to Netanyahu now, or else maybe the flip side is that they say, we have to get rid of him. We can't have a country where the leader is a pariah amongst, at least two continents. Yeah. So do things start to happen very quickly now? Is Netanyahu replaced? Does he lose a vote of confidence? Is this the time when, if you like, the opposition acts and they say, well, we can't carry on like this? I mean, I think that'll be really interesting now to see which way Israel's political class and indeed its voters go.
I think Israel will be as divided as ever. I think that Netanyahu's supporters are there. That yes, there are big protests outside his house and outside the Knesset and the like. But I think that what you'll see is the Israeli society divided. Although there is one issue that unites all Israelis, and that is getting the hostages released. And so far, we are over a year into this awful war, and they still haven't been released. And Hamas is still apparently posing some kind of risk that means that Israeli bombs are still falling on parts of northern Gaza or anywhere else.
I mean, and it can be both, can't it? Because it can be, and I suspect it probably will be, a fillip for Netanyahu in a short term. In a sense, he will be able to wrap himself around the flag, and he will be able to do the Millwall thing. He'll be able to say, look, everybody's against us, but I don't mind. I don't care, because all I care about is Israeli national interest, and I won't bow to a foreign call, all of that kind of rhetoric, the sort of populist rhetoric around it. And we've seen even Benny Gantz, in the last few minutes as we've been talking, Benny Gantz was in the coalition government long-time sort of critic and political foe of Netanyahu, now an opposition leader, himself has slammed the warrants as a historic disgrace that will never be forgotten. Because Israelis, this entire period has cemented the idea, which has long been at the centre of Israeli national psychology, which is they are under siege. And now they feel under siege from the world. So that could augment his position in the short term. But in the long term, surely it is a destabilising force, because you cannot have in the long term a prime minister who is wanted for war crimes, unable to travel.
The only thing I would add to that is the historical context of this for Israelis, going back to the Holocaust, where Israelis, now that they have their own homeland, think that the only people that they can rely on to defend themselves are themselves, and that therefore the rest of the world can go do whatever it wants. Israel will defend itself and think that it has to act in its own interest. Now, whether, as Emily raises the question, they now come to the conclusion that Netanyahu is a positive barrier or hindrance to that remains to be seen. But it kind of, the world is against us is something that is kind of almost ingrained in the Israeli psyche.
And it's echoed in Trump's language. If you genuinely think, because I think a lot of the Netanyahu cabinet, and maybe wider in Israel, believe that these international institutions are stacked against them, that they do not understand Israel's very unique position. If they genuinely believe that they are misunderstood and attacked, then you will get the same sort of response maybe as you do to Trump right now, which is that the whole system's against us, the whole system's against you, and you've got to help me fight it.
Just again, in the last few minutes, Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, Israeli Labour politician, so on the more moderate side of things, has said that the decision from the court has chosen the side of terror and evil over democracy and freedom, the very system of justice, and has accused the court of turning, quote, the very system of justice into a human shield for Hamas's crimes against humanity. So it's clear that in the short term, at least, Israel, the world might think one thing, or at least the international court thinks one thing. Israel thinks something very different.
We'll be back in a moment, looking back on John Prescott's contribution to the Labour Party, to British politics, and his lasting legacy.
The Deputy Prime Minister got off his bus at Rhyl in North Wales and quickly realised that to reach the local Labour club, he had to run the gauntlet of a group of largely countryside and fuel protesters. As he walked through them, a local man chucked an egg at him almost at point-blank range. John Prescott immediately swung round and landed a punch straight on his jaw.
John's John.
Yeah, John is John, as Tony Blair famously said in the news conference after that moment.
One of my earliest political memories, that.
Is it really?
Yeah. Partly because it happened in Rhyl, near where my nan and granddad lived. But it was. I remember it and think it was very funny.
Well, everyone wondered, oh my God, can he carry on as deputy leader? And, and there was a debate that took place. And he could carry on as deputy leader. And funnily enough, John Prescott gave an interview a few years ago saying, when I die, I'm worried that all anyone will remember is the punch. And here we are. Here we are on the newsagents launching into our obituary of John Prescott.
With a left hook.
With a left hook. Yeah. Actually, I think it was a right hook, wasn't it?
And I guess we have to say John was John, because that is where we are today. But that phrase of Tony Blair's, I think, summed up so much more than just the punch. And the thing you forget about the punch is that he actually carried on wrestling him to the ground. I mean, it wasn't just like one whack. They actually were on each other's shoulders. But the fact that Tony Blair was asked in this press conference how to explain it, and everyone was, asking if it was sort of the end of his job and at the end of his seat, and it was in the election campaign, and that was what Blair came up with. And we kind of understand that in a weird way now as prefiguring the political age we're in, that some politicians do have a sort of visceral sense of the public in a way that many others don't. And you can't explain it. You just have to kind of shrug and go, yep, that's what he does.
We should explain for younger listeners who might not really remember him, because he did leave office in 2007, and just remind people who he was, because he was deputy prime minister. He's the longest serving deputy prime minister we've ever had. He was prime minister for 10 years, like with Blair for 10 years, and he was kind of like a kind of bridge for the new Labour project. Blair was the new. And to some extent, although it can be overdone, Prescott was the old. He was an old working class bruiser. He'd been in the trade union movement, steeped in the trade union movement. And Blair had sort of said that he was almost his emissary to sort of that part of the party, that he could speak to parts of the party that perhaps Blair couldn't naturally speak to because he was northern, because he was working class, because he was not like the kind of sort of highly polished Blair type figure. And he was a moderniser in all sorts of ways himself as well. He was very subscribed to the New Labour project, but he was certainly to the left of where Blair was, but a fiercely loyal kind of trooper for him and a fiercely loyal deputy, and someone who as well, in the internecine battles of the Blair-Brown years, often acted as something of an emissary and go-between between the two of them.
He was a very important figure during that whole period. And I think just to describe him as old Labour isn't doing him justice. He's certainly working class. And he was that kind of rough diamond working class. He hadn't been to university like so many other kind of Labour leaders who'd come through the Labour movement, who had then gone on to Ruskin College at Oxford, which was, you know, kind of the Workers' Education Association sort of next steps for up and coming leaders. He was who he was. He had been a ship's steward on the liners. So he was, you know, one of the people serving at tables. And I remember Nicholas Soames, Old Etonian, grandson of Churchill, when Prescott would stand up in the Commons, Soames would go, "2 gin and tonics, Giovanni." And it was designed to be slightly braying, off-putting, condescending. I mean, of course, the Commons is a place where you're trying to put your opponents off their step. But I think he was a victim of that, as well as in making him emboldened and even more determined to fight the good fight. And with Tony Blair and Prescott, they formed a formidable duo.
I think he wouldn't want to be described as a victim of that, because I know exactly what you're saying in terms of the kind of sort of horrifying like classism of that time particularly. But I think the point about Prescott was that he gave as good as he got, you know, and there's a clip that we might bring you of him sort of standing up opposite Jeremy Clarkson when he's been invited on. I mean, he sort of became quite a sort of a popular sort of game show politician as well, you know, and he's invited on to star in a reasonable priced car for Top Gear. And he starts just talking to the audience. He takes over and he outdoes Jeremy Clarkson and he becomes much more a man of the people. That was his shtick, really. I mean, he was unashamed of being grumpy and irascible. I remember him as being pretty rude, to be honest, to younger women, you know, in television studios. And it comes back to the Blair thing. That's who he was. You know, he wasn't ashamed of it, definitely wasn't ashamed of where he'd come from or the jobs he'd done. And he gave back twice as hard as he took.
I think there's a really interesting thing about Prescott, thinking about the sort of politician he was. And Emily, you've alluded to it with all the Top Gear stuff. He sort of embodied something which came to be considered an even more valuable property in politics, which is authenticity, which has been the kind of byword of our political age. And I think in a weird way, Prescott was both sort of behind and ahead of his time. He was sort of a bit sandwiched in a way for him, which is unfortunate for him. He was behind in the sense that he did run briefly for leader, but he was never going to get it because he was out of step with the kind of mores of that time. He was still, although he wasn't quintessentially old Labour, he was still associated a bit more with the left of the party. That kind of bluff kind of character just didn't really sit with the kind of sort of smoothness of the 1990s, far more PR'd, all that sort of thing. And yet when we think about our own time, we can imagine a kind of young John Prescott doing exceptionally well in the sort of politics that we have now, because he was what he was, in that way that Boris Johnson is, or Donald Trump is, or Angela Rayner is today. And Angela Rayner is probably the sort of closest, and she herself has sort of set herself up in his image and said that she's taken inspiration from him. In an era where people have come to loathe kind of very smooth-talking politicians, and even politicians who, like him, had working-class backgrounds, but go to university and start to speak in a slightly smoother, slightly more polished way, he sort of embodied that kind of himselfness, that authenticity that came to be very prized. And I think that when centre-left parties, progressive parties, are now looking at their electoral fortunes, and we're seeing what's going on with the Democrats right now, to some extent with Labour as well, when they're facing reform, they are looking for more Prescotts. They need more Prescotts because they are people, whatever their wider problems or deficiencies or inadequacies or whatever they happen to be, they are people. I mean, he said himself famously about that punch, Tony told me to connect with the electorate. And he did. And he did connect with the electorate. And politicians like that do connect because they don't appear to have artifice. So Prescott is very a la mode in a way. He's very much of our own age.
But I would say that there's a danger in sort of romanticising this. I mean, Prescott wouldn't have said, isn't it great I didn't go to university?
No.
He'd say, he was part of a government that wanted to send, 50% of all young people to university.
Yeah.
And when we talk about his, difficulty with words sometimes, and I remember those interviews that he had to start again and again because he wanted to get his words right. He was dyslexic. I don't think he'd be holding that up as a kind of like, isn't it wonderful that I'm dyslexic and authentic? I think he would have, obviously been much happier to be part of an age where that was recognised without people laughing at him. And so I do think we slightly romanticise this idea of the good old working class chap. And of course, the reason I guess you're not seeing as much of it, maybe with this front bench, the front bench that's now the government in power, is because, guess what? They did get more polished and they have been to university and they have sort of, gone on to higher education. And I think there's a danger that we kind of, I don't know, we sort of go, oh, the good old days when they're all authentic. I don't think it means that our front bench politicians aren't authentic just because, they don't have as stronger accents. That's kind of crazy.
Well, I agree with that. But I think that it's not just about authenticity. It's about connection, isn't it? It's about having politicians who, for whatever reason, resonate with people, who people look at and they feel are real people. Now, again, that can be quite unfair to, all politicians are real people, but they don't necessarily stand out. And I suppose the point about Prescott is that he stood out. And I'm not necessarily saying that I particularly like the fact that we live in an age where we put such premium on those people who stand out, because more often than not, those people who stand out aren't great and often are quite damaging, as we've seen for our politics. But nonetheless, that is the age that we're living in. And it is hard for politicians to cut through the noise. And progressive parties, in a way, if that is the age we're living in, we're seeing that kind of more reactionary parties have been far better at creating those phenomena. And in a way, progressive parties can't just keep turning up with slightly bland people to that knife fight, a water pistol with a knife fight. They have to have those characters. And I think, as I say, Prescott would have been one of those had he been a bit younger.
Yeah, and he made people laugh. He
made people laugh. Yeah, exactly.
Keep understanding now is an important part of politics.
And Emily, it's so funny you should say you never knew what you were going to get. I had a lot of interactions with Prescott when I was a political correspondent, and Labour were in opposition, and he was going to he became deputy leader, and then he became deputy prime minister. You never knew whether you were going to get friendly John Prescott or sulphurous explosive John Prescott, of which or
punchy John Prescott,
and I once found myself in the middle of a row between him and Peter Mandelson, which kind of was a very odd time to kind of find yourself being there at a moment like that. And John Prescott was bloody difficult, but he was also incredibly effective in what he did. I do think it's funny that we started with that clip of the punch, and what was it about? Who were the protesters? Who were the angry protesters? Farmers.
Farmers. Countryside Alliance lot.
Countryside Alliance lot. And where were we 2 days ago? On the streets of Whitehall, farmers angry with a Labour government. It's amazing how history comes round.
Doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think just finally, because I've got to play this clip. I think sometimes as well, people look back at Prescott because they're also looking back at an age where they felt. I mean, I think sometimes this is wrong, but people often feel that there were even more sort of great sort of characters in politics. Yeah, exactly. And there's this clip which has been doing the rounds today of, I don't know where it's from as a show, but it is a clip of Ken Clarke, who was then the health secretary, and John Prescott, who was on the shadow front bench, turning up doing an interview in Ronnie Scott's, the jazz nightclub in Soho, which Ken Clarke often went to. And I didn't know apparently Prescott used to go to a fair bit as well. I didn't know that. And this is them talking about the fact that when they were done with work at the Commons or back at the department, they would often go to Ronnie's.
I've wound up debates against John, and I can't go to sleep when I wound up a debate. The adrenaline gets going. And I've left debates, and the driver's driven to Ronnie's when I left the house. He knew I wasn't going to go home, and he dropped me off here. And I spent the night unwinding and relaxing.
Have you closed any more hospitals down?
Not in your patch, but good to see you on neutral ground.
Have you closed any more hospitals then? What an intro.
I mean, it's so much more civilised in the Commons, isn't it, really?
Not in your patch.
Not in your patch. And that was Prescott.
And Clarke.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny hearing the Tories speaking warmly, because Prescott wasn't a clubbable guy.
No.
I mean, he didn't. He thought Tories. I hate the Tories.
Well, the clip goes on to say that they don't sit together when they're there. So probably tells you something. Right. Well, tomorrow we will be getting into one of the debates, or a bit of politics is, I think, going to dominate next week, which is the debate on assisted dying. The second reading of the assisted dying legislation, which MPs have been grappling with for some weeks now, is coming up next week. The MP who is behind that, who has been leading the charge on that, is Kim Leadbeater, the MP for Spen Valley. She came top of the private members' ballot, which basically means a backbench MP can introduce a piece of legislation of their choice. She has chosen to do this on assisted dying and has therefore been leading the campaign around it. And I went to speak to her a couple of days ago, and we're going to be bringing you that interview where she explains why she's doing what she's doing, and a slightly wider-ranging interview as well, because she is an exceptional MP in all sorts of ways, particularly given, of course, she only has her seat at all because she is the sister of Jo Cox, the murdered Labour MP. She took her seat some years after Jo was murdered, and we talk a little bit about that and about her impressions of politics since she was elected to Parliament. It's a really interesting listen.
Right, look forward to that. And just also to say one other thing, which is our live show at the Royal Albert Hall. An extra tranche of tickets have been released, so if you missed out the first time, there are a few tickets still available for us at the Royal Albert Hall on December the 1st.
Have we thought about doing a sort of Willy Wonka and putting them in chocolate bars in actual newsagents? Golden tickets. Is that possible? Can we do that?
I think it may be a little late to do it just
late in
now,
the day.
but why don't you go and speak to sales and marketing?
Go speak to Dillon's.
Yes.
Is Dillon's still going?
Dillon's?
Yeah, the corner shops. No,
what are
no,
you talking
they gone?
about?
If anyone's seen a Dillon's, let us know, because I reckon they still are there somewhere. Or a one-stop. That's what we used to have in Birmingham. Anyway, go and buy our live show tickets, the last ones. It's going to be a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.